so a few years back I did a video which is my most viewed video by far on YouTube, which is all the Bop Harmony you need to know in 20 minutes. That video is very compressed and probably quite confusing to a lot of people. But actually, now I've moved on a bit in my understanding, I think it is now possible to compress all the Bop Harmony you need to know into about 10 minutes. Okay? I'm just going to introduce you to something which is a very, very simple thing, but makes so much... it's a really useful thing for just making what you play sound a lot more bop, right? So this is what I call the backdoor concept, which is that basically any time you see a 2-5-1, be it minor, major, whatever, you can always replace it with what we call the backdoor dominant, which is a term which is known widely throughout jazz education. Should be reasonably familiar, but I'll explain like this. So for instance, like if we're going into a C major chord, we could use the B flat 7. And there's some tunes that are already written like that. For instance, the first few chords of the song The Yardbird Suite, or sometimes it's called What Price Love by Charlie Parker, is ya bum ba da ya booty da da da, or you know, Lady Bird. That's the same thing, right? Or sometimes it's a 2-5. Sometimes you get an F minor in there as well, F minor 7. So that backdoor thing is the same. Now, modally, scalically, what you play over that is generally some sort of dominant scale. So you can actually play the Mixolydian mode. This is the thing that Charlie Parker did most often, which in bebop circles we tend to call the dominant scale. Or you could play, of course, a Lydian dominant or a 4 melodic minor, depending how you look at it. Okay, so those are your main options. In this video, I'm going to concentrate on using the dominant scale, and I'll make my reasons for that clear a little bit later on, but you could just as easily use some melodic minor mode, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so this is how it can actually be really, really useful to us. Okay, so this is something that actually comes out of the guitar. If you played any kind of gypsy jazz, then you probably know this voicing here. This is an A9 voicing. It's really gypsy jazz voicing, right? Nice and sort of earthy and dark. So you might look at this, and if you are thinking along the sort of lines that I think along, you might be thinking, well, actually, just like A9 is just literally just a C sharp minor 7 flat 5. And if you are indeed thinking along those lines, then you are not missing a trick, because you can use the A9 to substitute in for the C sharp minor 7 flat 5. And of course, we can extend that all around the keys, so that, for instance, if we're playing a minor 2-5-1 in the key of D, like, you know, the first few chords of something like Beautiful Love, or Alone Together, or Yesterdays, just to give you tune context for that, then you can actually replace the E minor 7 flat 5 with a C9, okay? And what's the advantage of that, you might say? Well, we can use the dominant scale. Now, this is something I've covered in a few videos, because, you know, for instance, there's the Y minor 7 flat 5 isn't the thing video that I put out a few months back. And that's all great, but actually this is a slightly different perspective on it. So if you already know this, bear with me. The reason why this works so well is because actually, if you spend any time studying bebop, you're going to spend a lot of time learning phrases that work over either major 2-5s or dominant chords. If you're a Barry Harris devotee, for instance, you just boil everything down to dominant chords. More mainstream jazz education might talk about 2-5s, but it's the same stuff, right? You're just learning how to play language over that thing and then resolving it to major or minor or dominant target chords. And because of that, it's useful to have as many situations as possible where you can apply all that lovely bebop language you learn. So for instance, if I play a C dominant bebop scale, you know, sorry for any Barry fans, we don't like to call them bebop scales, but that's what a lot of people know it as. It's a C dominant scale, C dominant bebop. We can put that over E, and it sounds great. It sounds like an E minor 7 flat 5 chord, right? Okay, now we might know some other bits of language, so we might have this honeysuckle rose motif as well, something like that, or you know, some kind of arpeggio bass line. And And then already, we've got interesting things we can play over the E minor 7 flat 5, okay? Which is a win, I think, because a lot of people don't have interesting things to play over E minor 7 flat 5. Now that's all great. Obviously, it takes people a bit of a time to, become accustomed to making that sort of conversion. But what I find makes it a bit easier is if you just say, all right, for any major or minor or dominant chord that I'm going to, I can approach that chord from a tone below, which is our backdoor chord. So for D minor, we can approach it from C7. Now, how do we play the 5 chord? Well, if you're a Barry Harris fan, you'll know that you can run that scale down to the 3rd of A7, which is C sharp. So in this case, C7, I'm running down to the 3rd of A7, which is C sharp. But in practice, and here's the interesting thing, this is what Barry was talking about the other night, you don't actually need to do that. And he said it this way, so don't become locked into the harmonic minor. For instance, like we might think of the harmonic minor being the sort of bebop scale that we might play on the A7 flat 9 chord. And you do indeed hear that scale a lot in Bud Powell and Charlie Parker. But if we get locked into that, what happens is that we actually run into problems with using half steps and stuff. It's much easier to use the dominant scale. So with this in mind, we just use the dominant scale, and then if we fancy putting a C sharp in there, we can, but we don't have to. So I'm just going to play you that the little dominant scale run. And then we're going to go to a little enclosure on the A or the 5th of D minor. So it's just a straight bebop dominant scale. So if I play that works very well as a minor 2-5-1 line. We can extend it a little bit in the way that we did earlier. Nary a C sharp in sight. Okay, so in a few other videos I've been talking a lot about how we don't need to play the 3rd of the dominant. And in fact, if we always include the 3rd of the dominant in our lines, then often it can actually sound a little bit academic and a little bit like boring. And there's many harmonizations and many melodies in jazz where that just doesn't happen. So for instance, I use the example of Blue Bossa, where we get, the notes C and B flat. Yeah. Ya ba da boom boom ba dum. Ya ba 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 ba. Ba 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 bum. Okay. And I use other examples like all blues and stuff like that. So there's a lot of times in jazz harmony where the 3rd of the dominant is just not expressed. I also use a Kenny Wheeler example. Kind Folk does the same thing. So we are really at liberty just to include the 3rd if we want, or not include it if we want. And sometimes it's a bit cooler not to include it. Right. For major 2-5-1s, it's the same thing. So if I want to play a 2-5-1 into C major, I can actually again use the back door, which is a tone below. So I go B flat into C. Do this. So let's start off with the D minor. Why not? Ah, nice, huh? So there I was just playing notes completely out of the B flat 7 scale. I was actually playing this kind of extended arpeggio figure, which is actually a what is it? G. Sorry, F. F minor 11th. You could do something simpler. Now, if you're like thinking chords scalically, you might take this phrase and think it has something to do with the dominant scale, but it doesn't. Right, sorry, with the altered scale, because that's a sharp 9, that's a flat 9, that's a 1, that's a flat 7. Classic altered scale use. You write it down in your book, you get full marks in your exam. But actually, if we just view it from the point of view of B flat 7, it's all diatonic, right, isn't it? It's almost silly to say it. Then we have a little, what Barry Harris would call a 4 ending, or what we could also call an enclosure of the major 3rd, which by the way, we also used on the 5th of the minor chord in the example a little bit earlier. So let's do a bit of G. Now that sounds really boppy to me. And of course, we can add in that third, that B flat. I use, so if I just take you through that, B flat, okay, in this B flat 7 scale, B natural, we do a little diminished thing, but then we go back to the B flat 7 scale. So the third of the dominant, what I'm saying, is completely optional, but always play the backdoor to get that feeling of smooth sophistication, which the boppers really liked. Now, of course, the next step up from there is to play the tritone substitution. I'm not going to talk about that in that video, but that's kind of the next thing. Again, it's just a more interesting way of getting into the target chord. So, you know, if I play the same, like that, for instance, I'm just playing C7 going in. So I'm playing D flat 7 going into C major, which is the same thing. It's just a different chord going to a different chord. So with that, basically everything you need to know in bebop is found in the dominant scale and in the dominant chords and in the application of dominant chords, and that is coming up to 12 minutes. So I don't think that's doing too badly. Now go away and play with that and have fun. Thanks for watching. Bye.